Good evening, everyone. My name is Jan Traflet. I'm a professor in the College of Management, the Freeman College of Management at Bucknell University. I'm delighted to be with all of you tonight and to be with our two guests, Naomi Schaefer Riley and Jason Riley. For those of you who might be new to our audience today, our BPALC stands for the Bucknell Program for American Leadership and Citizenship. We're delighted to, with BPALC, to be dedicated to encouraging thoughtful and civil dialogue on important topics, like what is the meaning of freedom and how we can work towards perfecting a good society, however we may define that. On many of these big issues, there's likely to be disagreement, sometimes profound disagreement, which is all the more reason we should be discussing and listening to these issues from multiple perspectives. Tonight's BPALC webinar is co-sponsored by the Open Discourse Coalition, opendiscoursecoalition.org. And we bring to Bucknell two outstanding journalists, the husband-wife duo of Naomi and Jason Riley. Let us please welcome Naomi and Jason Riley. So let me please introduce both of the speakers, and then we'll segue into some of their latest research. So Naomi Schaefer Riley is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum. In her writings, she explores deeply child welfare issues, religious communities in America, philanthropy, and education, among other subjects. Among her many well-acclaimed books are Be the Parent, Stop Banning Snapchat, and Stop Banning Seesaws and Start Banning Snapchat. And here's the book here. She also has written Till Faith Do Us Part, which explores interfaith marriages, The Faculty Lounges, God on the Quad, The New Trail of Tears, and her latest book, which you can pre-order on Amazon, is the book No Way to Treat a Child. They're here with us tonight, and Jason Riley is also with us tonight. Jason is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and a commentator for Fox News. His writings focus on critical issues at the intersection of public policy, race, economics, immigration, and education. His latest book, which is due out very soon, is called Maverick, and it's a compelling intellectual biography of someone who's a living legend, economist Thomas Sowell. Jason has also authored False Black Power, Please Stop Helping Us, How Liberals Make It Harder for Blacks to Succeed, and also Let Them In, which is the case for open borders, and among many other writings. And so we're going to begin by letting Jason speak to us for a few minutes about what brought him to study Thomas Sowell and some of the insights he's gleaned from his extensive research for his upcoming book Maverick. And then we'll switch to Naomi, and then we'll do some back and forth, and we'll end with fielding some Q&A from the audience. So Jason, can you give us a little background on your own interest in Thomas Sowell and how you found Thomas Sowell, and then maybe talk a little bit about your some of the key insights from your book?
Sure. First, I want to thank you for that introduction and for the invitation to be here today. Naomi and I have been speaking on college campuses for a long time, and I personally have learned not to take these opportunities for granted anymore. I don't think you can do that given what's been going on in academia recently. A few years ago, the University of Chicago began sending out letters to incoming freshmen that explained the school's commitment to academic freedom and diversity of thought, how they don't support trigger warnings and safe spaces or cancel invited speakers because the topic might be too controversial. That used to go without saying on college campuses. It used to be understood. Now it needs to be stated explicitly in writing to new students, which I think says something about where we are today and not something good. couple years ago, a study was released on free speech at the University of North Carolina, and it concluded that conservative students are 4 times as likely as liberal students to worry about being open about their views with faculty out of a concern for retaliation. I don't think this is right. It's not what college is supposed to be about. College ought to be a place where students are exposed to different points of view, where their sensibilities are challenged. They learn to grapple with alternative perspectives and formulate coherent responses to those perspectives. And on a lot of campuses today, unfortunately, that is not happening, or not happening to the extent that it should be. So again, I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to be here and participate in this event this evening. In terms of Thomas Sowell and my interest in Sowell, that goes back some decades to when I was an undergraduate in college and working on the college newspaper, in fact. And a fellow student overheard a conversation I was having with some of my colleagues on the paper and said, "Jason, you sound like Tom Sowell." And I said, "Tom who?" And the person wrote down the name of a book that Sowell had written a few years earlier on civil rights. And I went to the library that evening at the school and checked it out and read it in one sitting, and went back the next day and checked out the library's entire collection of Thomas Sowell. And I've been hooked ever since. So he's had a tremendous impact on my own intellectual development. I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today without his influence, the influence of his writings. In terms of Sowell's relevance to tonight's discussion, I think there are a couple things I'd say. One is Sowell's an economist by training. His specialty is the history of economic thought, the history of ideas. So he's studied the sort of classical liberal economists, John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Jean-Baptiste Say, people like that, and that's his real specialty. Although he's best known for his writings on race and culture and so forth. And when he has weighed in on those topics, I think where he has distinguished himself is with his honesty and his straightforwardness. No matter how controversial the topic might be, he brings this sort of sober analysis, empirically based, fact-based analysis to these discussions. And I think that is needed today, perhaps more so than ever. You might think that that's nothing special in an intellectual, telling the truth and being honest, but in fact it is, unfortunately. You have a lot of academics, a lot of scholars who are more interested in being politically correct, more interested in being popular. And so they are sometimes reluctant to follow the facts where they lead and report those conclusions straightforwardly. And Sowell has not shied away from that. And that's, I think, one of the areas he's distinguished himself. And finally, I'd add another area would be in, well, let me put it this way. In researching the book, I, as you can imagine, went through dozens upon dozens of interviews he had done. And he was often asked by the interviewer, how does it feel to be so out of step with in your views on issues of race with other Blacks? And Sowell would always have to correct the question. And he said, I think you mean, how does it feel to be out of step with other intellectuals when it comes to issues of race in this country? And I don't think that he would say, he'd say, I don't think that Black intellectuals are any more representative of everyday Blacks than white intellectuals are of everyday whites. And that's something I think we should keep in mind when we're having these discussions on public policy today and how it affects Black people in general. And we should always make a distinction, or always make sure that we understand that there could be a gap, and sometimes a quite wide gap, between Black elite opinion, what you're hearing from commentators, people in my profession, elite media figures, academics, scholars, and so forth, and what everyday Blacks think about a subject, whether it's affirmative action or voter ID laws or defunding the police. And you will often find very wide gaps between what these elites are saying on behalf of Black people and what Black people themselves are telling pollsters. So that's another area I think where Sol has really distinguished himself.
Very, very interesting. And I loved it in your book when you were talking about your moment of enlightenment with when you were in college of finding soul and finding a kindred soul, no pun intended, but and what you're saying about just um, the difficulties of in the challenges that soul had in academia, and also much of the kind of what's been happening in college campuses today, and just um, it's been challenging times, including with the pandemic. But can you maybe share with us a little bit more about the book and some of the your, you call it an intellectual biography, and yet you are intimately familiar with his life story, and so maybe share a little bit about his trajectory, and with the audience who might not be so familiar with his, his his birth in North Carolina and how he came to Harlem, and dropped out of high school. Can you maybe elaborate on some of that?
Sure, he had a quite an unusual upbringing. You would not think someone from his humble beginnings would wind up where he is today, which is at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, as a scholar in residence, where he's been since 1980. But Sol is he'll be 91 years old, I think, this year. I think it's 1930, and was born into poverty in the Deep South during Jim Crow, Depression era Deep South, and outside of Charlotte, and was orphaned as a child. His father died before he was born, and his mother died in childbirth to a younger sibling of Tom. So he did not know his parents. He was raised by a great aunt who eventually moved the family. She had two adult daughters, and they moved north to Harlem when Sol was 8 or 9 years old. And so he was raised in New York City's Harlem neighborhood, and had a very sort of difficult home life. He was a very bright student, attended one of the city's more elite schools. Stuyvesant High School still is one of New York's most elite schools. Very academically strenuous. You have to take a test to get in, and excelled there. But his home life, unfortunately, forced him to drop out. He never graduated from high school. He later earned his GED after a stint in the Marines during the Korean War. And so Sol is not someone who graduated from undergraduate school until he was 28 years old, which is not the usual trajectory of an academic or a scholar. So he got kind of a slow start, but he's more than made up it. And as I said, his discipline is economics, but he's written quite widely on any number of subjects, from the law, history, culture. He's someone who has long taken pride in being able to explain his discipline to non-academics, to non-scholars. He has written books for his fellow intellectuals, but and this is something I think he got from one of his mentors, Milton Friedman, who he studied under at the University of Chicago, and when he was earning his PhD. After Friedman left teaching, he too spent a great deal of time talking to non-intellectuals about economics, writing columns for popular publications, writing books, lecturing widely. And Tom, that rubbed off on Tom. He has spent a great deal of his career writing for non-scholars, writing for the general public. He thinks it's a very important role for an intellectual to play, not simply to speak to their fellow academics, but to explain themselves to the general public. And so Although Tom is best known for some of his writings on race and culture, actually his best-selling book, among the roughly 40 that he's written, is called Basic Economics, which is essentially an economics textbook
Yeah.
without any graphs or charts or jargon in it. And he takes great pride in that. That is by design.
Yeah. I love how he talks about the importance of um, speaking to the ordinary person. And I think so much in academia that sometimes we speak to a very small audience and various journals that might be highly ranked, but aren't getting out communicated to the masses. And yet Sol's ideas have percolated enormously through society. And yet in some ways, he hasn't gotten as much credit as perhaps is due. So can you weigh in on that?
Well, I think with Soul, he was canceled before it was cool. He's someone, and this is due primarily to his writings on race and culture, his views on inequality, his views on the role that racism plays in the advancement of a racial or ethnic minority group. He simply comes at it from a different perspective, a different angle, and it's something that a lot of his fellow academics do not appreciate, and they have, in many ways, been able to sideline Soul and his scholarship, and so he is often not, or rarely mentioned when it comes to some of the leading Black intellectuals in America today. People like, a Cornell West or Orlando Patterson or Henry Louis Gates, or today, your Ta-Nehisi Coates or your Ibram X. Kendis. Tom has written circles around these individuals in terms of his academic output. And I would argue that his analysis he's a much more rigorous thinker than all of them, and some of them put together. But he has not received, I believe, his due in that regard, and that was one of the reasons I did want to write the book. I think he should be better known than he is today, and I think so much of what he's written on everything from social inequality, social justice issues, the reparations issue. We are still having these debates today, and I think Saul was way ahead of the curve when he was writing about these issues 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah. Uh, Very, very interesting. And I think I'm also very fascinated by how humble a person Thomas Sowell is. And that I think some of it is, in terms of him maybe not getting credit, is that he hasn't sought the limelight. And I think in your book, you quote him as saying that 90, or something about 95% of people have probably never heard of him, and that's okay with Thomas Sowell.
Yeah, he is more interested in getting his
I,
ideas out there, and he said that time and again, the goal is not to get credit for these ideas, but to have the right ideas prevail, particularly in public policy making that goes on. He's not big on offering solutions. He says, I'll leave that to others, but the people who do think they have the solution ought to know what they're talking about, ought to know whether these things have been tried before, and if they have, what has happened as a result. And one way he's distinguished himself is in looking at not only what some of these policies have done here in the U.S., but what they've done internationally in other countries where they've been tried. When it comes to welfare state policies or affirmative action policies or tax policies or what have you. So he takes a very broad view, and he's well known for his international comparisons. And that's one way. Another area I think where he's really made a mark.
Mhm. Yeah. And his emphasis always on following the facts, which you and Naomi as journalists must very much also appreciate. um, so in terms of BPALC and the Open Discourse Coalition, one of the things that there's everyone who is part of it has very different, that we don't have the exact same ideologies, that we have a lot of differences of opinions about things, but stressing the importance of listening to other viewpoints and also periodically questioning our own, deeply held tenets. And it's like, okay, can we re-examine it in light of new evidence and potentially change our minds about certain things? And thinking about Thomas Sowell's intellectual trajectory, I was fascinated by the fact that he had developed such a close relationship with Milton Friedman, and yet, as you note in your book, that when he took Milton Friedman's class, that Thomas Sowell was a Marxist, and he left the class being a Marxist, and yet he had a very strong relationship with Milton Friedman. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that friendship and mentorship.
Sure. I mean, Tom was Tom before he met Milton Friedman. Is the short answer to that. But yes, he began reading Marx in his late teens, actually, after he had dropped out of high school and was working, and picked up a set of encyclopedias, secondhand encyclopedias. There was an entry there on Marx, and he got hooked. And it's not unusual for a Black person of that generation to see the appeal in a Karl Marx, someone who seems to explain what that individual saw around them. The haves and the have-nots. Marx, pits the proletariat against the capitalist and the producers, and says that these people gain at the expense of others, and that made a lot of sense to someone in Tom Sowell's shoes in the 1940s, and he delved in he jumped in with both feet, and was a Marxist all through undergraduate school and all through all through taking his classes from Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago in the 1960s. And no, Milton Friedman did not persuade Thomas Sowell to give up his Marxism. Sowell says that was a job in government did that when he went to work for the U.S. Labor Department. He was doing some research on minimum wage laws in Puerto Rico, and realized they weren't having the effect that the proponents said they would have. Moreover, he realized that the government didn't really care, or not least the government government bureaucrats who were entrusted in enforcing this policy didn't much care. They had their own agenda. The government had its own agenda, and whether these policies were actually doing what they were supposed to do was almost a secondary concern. And Sowell read much more into that about the role the government plays, and the reasons that policies get perpetrated regardless of their effectiveness, or sometimes even if they're having a negative effect, they might continue to exist and be implemented. And so he began to drift away in the latter part of the 60s from his Marxism. One interesting thing to note about that, however, is Friedman didn't try to change Sowell into a free market capitalist. Friedman didn't see that as his job. Other economists teaching at the University of Chicago at the time, George Stigler, Friedrich Hayek was a giant in free market economics. Sowell studied under Hayek, took a course from Hayek at the University of Chicago when he was there. None of these people thought it was their job to indoctrinate their students. Which might tell you a lot about where we are today when it comes to what goes on college campuses. And one interesting story that Sowell tells is that when he was teaching a course in economics later in his career, he was teaching a course on Marxism, in fact. And at the end of the class, some students approach him and they say, "Professor Sowell, we really enjoyed this course, but we still have no idea what you think about Karl Marx and his ideas." And Sowell said, "That is the greatest compliment they could have paid me, because it was not my job to teach them what I personally thought about Karl Marx." And so I took it as a compliment.
Yeah. I remember once reading something about Walter Cronkite, and that people, when they listened to the Cronkite Hour, that Republicans thought he was Republican and Democrats thought he was Democrat, because he was so neutral in how he was giving the news. And so it sounds like Sowell was similar in the classroom. So in terms of so like he actually um in in some ways, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but he wasn't a professor for all that long before he did some time in several schools, but then he left academia rather early in his career.
He did. His first love was teaching. It wasn't research.
Yeah.
Wasn't writing books. He wanted to teach.
Oh,
But this was the 1960s, and things were happening on college campuses. Radical changes were taking place. You had the anti-war movement, you had the civil rights movement, you had the women's rights movement, you had the gay rights movement, and colleges were kind of trying to find themselves and feel their way. It wasn't clear who was in charge, the students or the teachers or the faculty or the administrators. And it was a very different place from what he attended as a student. Let's put it that way. And Soul, I think the final straw for him was when he was teaching economics at Cornell in the late 60s. And you had the student protest, the armed student protest, the takeover of the student union with students with guns and so forth. And Sol was just disgusted at the response of the administration to these acts, and not only at Cornell, but they were happening all
yeah.
across the country at the time.
Mhm.
And so he would stay in teaching through the 1970s, but he sort of had one foot out the door. He taught at Amherst, he taught at UCLA, where he eventually got tenure. But he was already dabbling in the think tank world. He had become more of a public intellectual, and was doing his own independent research and those sorts of things. And then when the Hoover Institution at Stanford made him an offer in 1980 that said, no teaching duties, no office hours, write what you want, he just sort of jumped at it. He started his column shortly after that, which he wrote for 30 odd years, a syndicated newspaper column. That's the way a lot of people know him, in addition to his
That's
books.
in
And
high
and that's what he's been doing. He's been churning out the books and the columns. He retired the column in 2016, I
school.
believe. But he published a book last year, a brand new book last year. He's still updating old editions of books that he's written before. So he hasn't completely retired, but he has slowed down a little bit.
Great. Well, I'm going to move to Naomi in a moment, but just before, as kind of a segue into some of the issues of child welfare policy and education, just maybe if you could give just a minute kind of summary of another mentor in Tom Soul's life, which was his friend who introduced him to the library. If you want to talk about that for a moment.
Oh, yeah, a childhood friend named Eddie Mapp, who passed away recently. I learned, someone sent me an email with the obituary. But when Soul first moved to Harlem as a child, his family had arranged for him to meet a boy who was a couple years older than him, named Eddie Mapp. And it, it was very fortuitous for Tom. This kid took him to libraries for the first time. He told him that if he didn't like the public school he was attending, he could apply to another school in the neighborhood, which had better outcomes, and Tom took him up on that. It was just he had someone to show him the ropes. And Tom never forgot that, and so I think he too has been quite generous with his time when it's come to mentoring other people, writing recommendations, offering advice, and so forth, going to bat for people who he feels are being treated unfairly. He hasn't hesitated to do that. But Eddie Mapp is someone who made an indelible impression on him. He's written about those experiences at some length in his own writings about his life.
Yes, yeah, I was very touched by that, and also just shows sometimes you think of a mentor as someone having to be a lot older than you. And
Yeah.
in this case, just someone just to show them how to take out a library book and not be afraid to get a library card and all those things that seem basic, and yet it's not basic if you've never been had exposure to it and stuff. And he said, I think he said at one point that he would never have been where he was today if he didn't start early on
Yeah.
reading. And it was like a critical time of, 7 or 8 years old where he started getting immersed in finding books that he liked and all of that. So really fascinating stuff. And I love how both you and your wife are on so many different subjects. And I know that you've written many other books, and thank you so much for giving so much time to Maverick, which is, you can pre-order today. Right? Is that right?
You can pre-order it. It'll be out on May 25th.
Okay, great.
So it'll be out next month, but you can pre-order it today. Yes, on Amazon.
Wonderful. Well, we'll loop back to you, but I want to spend some time hearing about Naomi's new book, No Way to Treat a Child, which is also available for pre-order. You guys seem to be matching each other in your speed of writing these days. And so I was wondering, Naomi, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us some thoughts on some of the divides we've experienced in terms of child welfare policy, how we can overcome some of the inequities in the system. I know you've done so much research on this, and we're really absolutely vitally interested in this topic, which I think is critically important.
Thank you. I just wanted to start by, echoing some of what Jason said. I mean, I too had the great experience of in college, I, had professors whose views I did not know politically, and they did not matter to me. And the professors were happy to teach me English and political philosophy and all sorts of things without any sense of the need to indoctrinate students. And the other thing that I think we both experienced on campus was exposure to journalism. And for me, that has been just this amazing opportunity to get to ask, questions that are kind of eating away at me, and get to call people or go visit them, and really, find out for myself what the answers are. So, there's a lot of people kind of wonder like how I've gone from writing about interfaith marriage to Indian reservations to other things like that. And frankly, I've been lucky enough to get to do this traveling and this research based on the questions that I really want the answers to. And, talking to people and getting to hear firsthand, what it's like, and delving into the research, for the last 20 something years has just been, has been a gift. And I hope that when I take on these topics, that I can, sort of translate some of what the experts are saying, into something that is, more readable and understandable for the general public. So that's sort of an introduction. I mean, I would say that I became interested really in the topic of child welfare during my first job out of college. I was an intern at the Wall Street Journal. And I was reading in the newspaper, there were regular stories. Unfortunately, I think, a lot of people sort of see these and kind of gloss over them because they're so tragic and difficult to read about, of children who had been repeatedly abused or neglected by their parents or guardians, and suffered tragic ends as a result of this. And I would go and ask, everyone I knew. I mean, I knew experts at different think tanks at the time. I was, I was new to New York, but I was really interested in the world of ideas. And I would ask people, what is going on here? Why is this bureaucracy of child welfare so bad? Why are we so bad at protecting these most vulnerable children? And I would say I really was very unsatisfied with the answers. I think the typical answer that I got from folks on the left was a question about money. If we put more resources into the world of child welfare, we would have more staff, we would be able to investigate more, we'd be able to offer families more services that would then help them. We'd be able to lift them out of poverty, and that would fix their abuse and neglect problems. And when I went to the right, I often got kind of a different answer, but in some ways also unsatisfactory. A lot of people on the right would say, look, this is the problem with the breakdown of the American family. We have huge rates of divorce. We have high rates of substance abuse. There's not a lot we can do to fix these families. And I think that's probably true, but it was a really unsatisfying answer to me because, you have these kids who are in the system now. There are 440,000 kids who are in the foster care system now. And are we just going to sort of say, oh, well, it's the breakdown of the family. What are you going to do? So I would say this question kind of followed me through my career. I spent some time as the editor of the Wall Street Journal's religion column. And during that time, I would periodically write stories about foster care and adoption in the context of churches and faith-based agencies. These were the people who were actually doing the work of taking in vulnerable kids. And I think as many of us are, just kind of gobsmacked at the way, people really sacrifice so much in their lives to take in these kids in a way that no one I knew was even thinking about. And I want to sort of get back to that question in a minute, like this divide between who's involved with child welfare and who's not. But I think, the final straw for me was actually doing research on Indian reservations a few years ago. And I started that book actually with the question of, why are Indian reservations so poor? And there's a lot to be said for that, some of it overlapping with the work that Tom Sowell has done about property rights and the rule of law and problems in those communities. But I think the thing that really I stuck with me the most, the hardest part of that book for me to write, were the questions about child welfare. There are some of the highest rates of abuse, neglect, child maltreatment deaths that occur in these communities. And poverty was not a sufficient answer. I mean, there are poor people all over the country who do a perfectly fine job of raising their kids. And I think it is actually a smear against people who are poor to suggest that, economic hardship automatically leads to child maltreatment, because it doesn't. So I sort of came away from that book saying, like, I really need to investigate this more. So I would say generally, like I said, people sort of read the headlines. But the vast majority of middle class and upper class people in this country have no contact ever with the child welfare system. They just don't, they don't understand what drives it. They don't understand what's driving abuse and neglect. They don't understand why kids have to be taken into foster care. And of late, the headlines they read are that the foster care system is driven by racism, frankly. There's been in the last year an entire movement that's sort of parallel to the defund the police or abolish the police movement, that's about abolishing foster care, that we just need to get rid of it and that will solve the problem. And I think that's about equally as likely to solve the problem as defunding the police is going to solve problems in minority communities in this country. So just to sort of give people a sense of what's going on here, most of the child maltreatment that's happening in this country, family structure is definitely at the heart of it. You're about 20 times as likely to suffer abuse as a child if you are living in a home with your mother and a non-relative male, as you are if you are living with two biological parents. There is something about that combination, you can attribute it to evolution or whatever you want, about having, about a man living with a woman and someone else's child in his house that leads to what can often be an explosive situation. And if you read all the headlines and get to, the 10th or 11th paragraph, inevitably that is often what comes out. So what happens then, though, is this investigation that happens. We send in social workers. Maybe there are some folks in your audience. I mean, there are often really well-meaning young college graduates who graduate with a major in social work or even a major in liberal arts, who think, this is where I can make an impact. I can help put families back together. And unfortunately, we don't do a very good job of training the people who go into that. They have really often mismatched expectations of what that job is like. They assume that most of these things can just be worked out. And it's really hard to have to remove a child from a home because you think that child is in danger. So there's about some place in this country, there's about a 40% turnover rate within a year of people who go into child protective services and this kind of work. So that makes it very difficult. Following that, you have a situation where family court is utterly a disaster. I don't know, again, how much of your audience really has any experience with family court, but it is just a morass of bureaucracy, of timelines where kids who are under the age of 3 could go 6 or 9 months or even a year between the time that they see a judge. That's like a third of their life. So, what is it that we can do about this bureaucracy is one of the questions that I have asked myself. And then on the other end, like, there are kids who are inevitably going to go into foster care. And so I think the one bright spot about this is that there are these groups increasingly of large churches and faith-based groups that are doing foster care better. I would say that they have enacted a kind of revolution over the last 10 years, 15 years or so. It used to be that you'd see like a kid's picture on the nightly news, Wednesday's child, like, anyone want this kid? I mean, it was offensive and also ineffective at the same time, which was kind of upsetting, because it was sort of broadcasting instead of narrowcasting. Nobody looks at that picture and is like, oh yeah, I'm going to call that hotline. However, there are some large churches in this country where, pastors would get up and say, there are 7 children in our zip code tonight who need homes. And this is something that our faith teaches us to do. And you get a whole different reaction. So the first thing they did was they recruited differently. Then they started training people differently. They offered, instruction in things like trauma-informed care. And then they also ensured that these people were supported. About half of foster parents quit within the first year. Obviously, there's a great deal of frustration just because, kids have all sorts of problems. But a lot of the frustration that these parents were experiencing was all that bureaucracy. Was getting treated poorly by caseworkers, was getting treated poorly by courts and judges. And so they would just throw up their hands and say, I can't take this anymore. And so one of the divides that I have been thinking about, again, is this question of who has contact with the system and how do we get good parents who have, stable, you'll excuse my saying, middle-class homes who are willing to take in these kids, because those are the people who are going to be able to, watch the system closely, to keep eyes on what's going wrong, and who I think will be able to fix it in the long run. And I think that there's enormous potential too in there. And I don't mean to sort of think about the kids in this utilitarian way, but it's very hard for most of us to have empathy for adults who have problems, stranger adults. Oh, it's their own fault, if they hadn't done this or that, and it's hard for us to sort of welcome that person into our home. But what happens in many of the cases where you have a family that takes in a foster child is now that family, when that child does go back, if they can, to their biological family, the foster family actually becomes invested in the foster child's future and in that family's future by extension. And I think that there is an important way that getting involved in the child welfare system, whether it's through foster care or becoming a CASA volunteer, which is a court-appointed special advocate, or finding other ways to help these kids, whether through mentorship or other things, can actually work to bridge the divide in our communities between, middle-class Americans who have communities and education and who are well-connected, and many of the people in this country who are now, who are alienated, who don't have a church community, who are unemployed. And how can we bridge that divide is a really important question facing our country now. And I think child welfare may be one of the keys to that.
I love that you have some optimism and many times, that there's agreement at what the problem is. Sometimes there's disagreement about what the underlying issues are. But it's so easy to criticize the existing system without pointing for a way forward. I remember I had a professor at Columbia who insisted, it was a history of New York City class, and he wanted all the students to, it's like everyone should spend one day in family court just listening to the stories and to really understand what's happening outside of our bubbles. But then to think about, okay, well, not just have empathy for it, but try to have some solutions and broadening the base. But at the same time, we've also as you pointed out, that there's an opposite movement, and maybe we should be, that some would argue that we need to be constricting it, and the types of people who, in terms of racial and other matches for foster care system and adoption, which you've written about as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about the current crisis at the border and some of those issues with children?
Well, I do want to address the racial question, because I think it's really important. It's very hard to find any story about foster care these days or child welfare that does not include some mention of the disparate rates of foster care. It is absolutely true that Black children are taken into foster care at a much higher rate than white children. White children are taken in at a higher rate than Asian children, and white children are taken in at about the same rate as Hispanic children, which I think should actually give us an interesting clue that it's not racism that's actually at work here. Like I said, abuse in this country is deeply tied to the issue of family structure. And unfortunately, we have in this country different races who are who have different family structures at different rates. There is a much higher percentage of single women living with, not the father of their child in the Black community than there is in the white community right now. Single parenthood is, of course, very widespread, but the danger really comes in with the non-relative male. Among Hispanics, you often see, a couple that is not married living together, but they are both the parents of that child. And so you don't have the same kind of risk factors. And for those who think that, it's just bias that is driving this, first of all, you could look at the abuse rates. They're about twice as high for Blacks as they are for whites in this country. But I also, if you think that data is being fudged, I encourage you to look at the deaths from child maltreatments, which are more than twice as high for Blacks as they are for whites. So if you are a caseworker who is thinking, is this child at risk? Do I have to take them out? I think your concern has to be the child in front of you. It cannot be, how do I make my spreadsheet come out even? And that seems to be the obsession of, every university, of every government agency, of every nonprofit these days. And my concern is, like, how do we think about the safety and well-being of the child who has been reported for abuse or neglect, and often by someone in their own community? You have situations, obviously there are mandated reporters who are typically, teachers or pediatricians, people that, who are living in the same community often as the family, but you also have neighbors and even relatives who are reporting these kids. It's not, there's this stereotype of, like, the nosy middle-aged white social worker, who goes looking for trouble, in poor Black people's apartments. That is not what's going on at all. In New York City, 85% of the caseworkers who work for the Administration for Children's Services are either Black or Hispanic. 85%. This is not a question of being driven by racial bias. This is a question of people people being reported for abuse or neglect, and then having to go investigate and see what's wrong. I also just want to say, I think people really underestimate the extent to which substance abuse is driving our child welfare problems. A lot of times people say, oh, neglect is really just poverty. Neglect is not poverty, for the most part. If what's happening is we have a safety net in this country. You could argue that it should be bigger. We should have bigger checks for people. But fundamentally, if you are the parent of a child and you do not have the means to get food for that child, or clothing for that child, or to have the heat on in your house, or to have a place to live, we take care of that. The government does have ways of taking care of that. But you as a parent have to have the wherewithal to be able to go seek out those services. And unfortunately, too often, the parents who are in these situations have a substance abuse issue, an addiction issue, a mental health issue, and it prevents them from caring properly for their children. And it's striking to me that when we just talk about substance abuse in the abstract, I think there's widespread acknowledgement in this country that we don't have a solution to substance abuse. Like, people go into addiction programs multiple times, and it is really hard once you have become, involved with opioids or whatever to get off that. But suddenly when we're faced with the issue of child welfare, people assume, oh, this is a problem, it's easily solved, and the parent is just sort of using occasionally, and that's fine. And and if we just put them in a 30-day program, this problem will be totally solved. And unfortunately, it's not. These are long-term problems, and they really are driving a lot of the child welfare numbers. When I talk to foster parents, few of them can think of a single child they have taken in where substance abuse has not been at the heart of the problem.
That's very sad and very compelling evidence that you give us on that topic. So in terms of for both of you, we have about 10 minutes left, and then we'll open it up for some questions. We talk a lot about, what is the American dream? Is the American dream in crisis? What's the likelihood of, and we all define American dream in different ways too. Do you think that the American dream is still alive in this country? And are there ways to help make it more of a reality? And, this whole theme of overcoming divisions. And I think that there might be some frustration with people feeling like it's not possible. And how do we give, so what's your take on it, and any solutions that you see, or more positive signs that, or negative signs, with whatever way you actually feel about it?
Go ahead, Jason.
Is
the
American dream in crisis?
I think the American dream is still very, very much alive. One of the problems we have, I think, is that we have a political environment that thrives on pretending otherwise. That you have political debates that I think are so far divorced from the reality of the situation in America today, so as to be almost comical. If you even looking at the racial disputes, divisions that we have today, Black people in America are by far the richest Blacks on the planet. The income disparities between Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans are far wider than the income disparities between Blacks and whites in America. Yeah. And over there, you're talking about people largely of the same race.
Yeah.
There opportunities for Blacks have never been more plentiful in this country than they are today. But like I said, you do have a political situation that depends on people believing otherwise. The Black franchise is in jeopardy. It's going to be snuffed out any day now. Police are targeting young Black men. They have a target on their back. That is the political debate. That's the debate in the media. But the reality, if you were to talk to someone who was alive, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, Blacks today are in a much better position than they've ever been in the history of this country. So I think that is this part of the problem. It's in reality, I don't think the under pre-COVID, for example, just to add some hard data to this, the Black unemployment rate was at a historical low.
Mhm. Yeah.
Black poverty rates were at historical lows. Hispanic poverty rates were at historical lows.
Mhm.
The incomes of the lowest quintile of earners were growing at a faster rate than their bosses.
Yes. Mhm.
But
Um,
I do think that,
so you have the reality, and then you have this this sort of political narrative that is happening alongside it. And so if you're only concentrating on that political narrative, you might think that we are headed to hell in a handbasket. But I think the data and the evidence suggest otherwise.
But I do think that the institutions that have traditionally been the path to helping people achieve the American dream are experiencing a lot of stress these days. And I think the family is definitely one of them. I mean, I think it's, it's definitely under siege in a lot of ways. I don't mean to sound apocalyptic about this, but I think families, religious institutions, community organizations, the kind of non-governmental institutions that have helped people, to get to know other people, to have a social safety net, to have support for themselves and their children. Those are not doing so well. And a lot of the schools in communities that need this kind of help are also not doing so well. And so, unfortunately, I think when some people talk about, how the American dream is not there anymore, they think, well, the way to restore it is through a variety of government programs. But those are not the programs that have traditionally allowed people to achieve the American dream, as Tom Sowell writes about too. And so I think we need to spend a lot more time worrying about these institutions and emphasizing, what's now called the success sequence, graduating from high school and getting married before you have children. Those are the kind of things that lead people to be able to achieve the American dream. And we can't just throw all that overboard and expect that Washington is going to come fix this problem.
Yeah. I always thought of the American dream as kind of the Horatio Alger story of pulling yourself up with your bootstraps from hard work. And then if you work hard enough, you're going to climb the rungs and all of that. And this connection between hard work and perseverance and success and some of the, those types of virtues. And I do think there's luck involved to some extent. But in terms of some encouraging news that I see in terms of just ways, in terms of broader economic equality or more reducing some of the inequities or reducing some of the differences in net worth across the country. It's been this interesting trend of retail investing and the millions of new investors that have flooded into the market in the past year during the pandemic. And it's some of the studies about the composition of those new investors is very interesting, that it's much more racially diverse than other categories of more experienced investors. And so that's an interesting trend. But I think you're onto something, Naomi, with many of your comments about the demise of the nuclear family and some of those issues that that are real problems that in terms of holding people back. So in terms of, let's move on to some questions, unless, Naomi, do you have anything else that is pressing on your mind about No Way to Treat a Child and solutions?
The last thing I wanted to mention, just because I know you like solutions, and this is one that has been kind of inspiring to me. Some folks are starting to use big data in order to understand our child welfare issues better. There's actually an experimental program going on in Allegheny County in Pennsylvania that allows people when somebody calls into a child abuse hotline, they can actually plug in certain data into the system, and it doesn't, tell you whether this child has been abused or not, but it does sort of have about 100 different risk factors that they have access to, and the computer spits out a score which tells the screener how urgently a case needs to be investigated. And when you get a bureaucracy that is really overwhelmed by calls and cases, it's a great way to do triage and to ensure that the kids who most urgently need the help are seen as quickly as possible. And the researchers who did it have seen enormous success, and they're trying to expand it across the country, but it's starting in Pennsylvania, and I think it's very promising.
That's encouraging to know that. Thank you very much. So moving to some questions for Jason and Naomi. We have one question that asks, and either of you can answer or both. So what do you think about the idea that if you're not a liberal when you're young, you don't have a heart, but if you're conservative when you're older, you don't have a brain? Any comments on that one?
Well, truisms become truisms for a reason.
Okay.
I think there is something to that. I think this is going to depend on how you define liberal and conservative, and on what issues you're talking about. Some values are formed in childhood that you never give up, and others are more malleable. But I think with experience, views do typically change. I will say, in relation to Sol and his starting out as a Marxist, there are any number of people, conservatives, or people who turned out to be conservatives, who started on the left and then moved right when they were older, including Milton Friedman, Sol's mentor.
Well, the famous phrase from Irving Kristol is that a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. So that happens, sometime toward the onset of adulthood, when you have children of your own, you have to pay taxes, you have a job, all these things kind of combine to mug you in this way, I guess.
I think we talked in one of our earlier conversations just about Reagan's idea of compassionate conservatism, Bush's idea of compassionate conservatism, and maybe a sense in recent years that some conservatives, the conservative doctrine lacks compassion. Would you want to address that, or talk about some of that stereotype?
Well, I think it's really, I think it's a huge problem. But I don't think it's true. I mean, I really do think that the solutions that Jason and I think about on a regular basis are solutions that are supposed to benefit the people who most need it. And whether it's having a police force that protects the most vulnerable citizens who live in high crime neighborhoods, or having a child welfare workforce that ensures that children are safe. You could say that the folks who are doing this work, are mean, and they shouldn't arrest people, and they shouldn't take kids away. But you have to sort of think about, like, what is the role of these people in society? And it is to ensure that the people who can't protect themselves are protected. And abolishing the police and abolishing foster care is not going to get you any closer. It may appear to you compassionate, but that will not be the end result.
Yes. Okay. Very good answer. One of the anonymous attendees had just asked a question about, Naomi, what would you say to families interested in getting involved with the foster system, but terrified of the bureaucracy involved?
I guess I think that the best thing to do is, if you can find, a good agency, a church that is involved in this. They often have people who are on the staff now who will kind of run interference for you and help you through the bureaucracy and help you understand what's happening in court and with the caseworkers. But that will help you understand it better, but it's not going to change the situation. I think it really is a hugely frustrating situation. It can take an enormous toll on families, on marriages, for people to become involved in this, to be treated badly by the bureaucracy. But the people I talk to say, they feel like they're called to do this because of the kids who are involved. And that's the only thing that I think is really going to get people past the bureaucracy.
Yeah, I think you're right about also the support systems of people helping you through the bureaucracy who've been in a similar boat, and but yeah, I can definitely understand the complexities of the bureaucracy being very intimidating in this process, and that's needs to be addressed.
Well, I mean, middle class people, I think we don't expect to have to interact with government bureaucracy. That we complain about standing in line for 2 hours at the DMV. I mean, if you're a child in the foster care system, I mean, your life is like the DMV. I mean, that's the kind of stubbornness and stupidity and slowness and inefficiency that you're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And that happens when you're a foster parent too.
Mhm. Yes, yes. So we have a very hard-hitting, excellent question here for you, Jason. It said, Jason only spoke to what he described as a false Black narrative about inequality and hope. Does that mean he accepts the current white grievance narrative?
I'm not sure I follow the question.
He only spoke to what he described as a false Black narrative about inequality and hope. Does that mean he accepts the current white grievance narrative?
Well, I will say this. I don't necessarily agree with the premise of the question to the extent that I understand it. But if you go and read a book like J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy,
Mm-hmm.
I read that book. I did not grow up privileged.
Mm-hmm.
I read that book, and if I didn't know that J.D. Vance was white,
Mm-hmm.
the circumstances he was describing
Mm-hmm.
sounded awfully, awfully familiar.
Mm-hmm.
Which is to say that to the extent that we have quote unquote white grievance in this country, I don't dismiss it as play acting. If you live in some of these communities that have been hard hit by the opioid epidemic, for example, you're not pretending. You're not making this up. The unemployment rates, the breakdown in the white families that we saw earlier in Black families is a real thing. There is empirical data to back this up. So no, I don't dismiss this out of hand at all. Absolutely not.
The follow-up question to that was, what about if you live in Greenwich, Connecticut? Not sure if I understand.
Yeah, I don't understand that either. Are people in Greenwich, Connecticut complaining? What are they complaining about?
Well, maybe we'll give a chance for that comment. I did like in your in one of your earlier books, False Black Power. I thought it was very interesting how it was structured, because in terms of your receptiveness to constructive criticism, that you had some two authors weigh in on your argument. John McWhorter from Columbia, and then Glenn Lowry. And then you did a response to McWhorter and Lowry, which was basically a response mostly to McWhorter because he had more of the issues. But this idea that that debate is important, and also a sense of listening to critics, and then going back and forth. I like the back and forth in that book.
Yeah. I think that's important. I think, you know, the Black community, whether you're and Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter are two Ivy League academics. They're way out of my league intellectually. I was very happy they stooped to responding to my little rantings in that book. But yes, there is a variety of viewpoints in the Black community, among Black thinkers, among Black academics and journalists and scholars. And too often, I think that is glossed over. I talked about Soul being canceled earlier in his career for his disparate views. But those views have always existed, whether or not the mainstream media wanted to acknowledge them. And too often, I think people in my profession, journalists, out of either laziness or disinterest, tend to turn to the same individuals and organizations to speak on behalf of Black people. And I often think they're not turning to the right organizations and individuals, not to mention the fact that there simply isn't a quote unquote black view. There are a variety of Black views.
Yeah, I guess maybe part of what that particular commentator was getting at might have been just sometimes in these conversations, we almost maybe need to emphasize more that racism does exist, and racism is a problem in the United States, and yet it's not and yet
well, does the questioner think that we don't talk enough about the existence of racism in America?
I mean, I think that
I don't know where they've been living if they think that we don't talk enough about the existence of racism in America. I don't know what conversation these days isn't.
No, I think
isn't had through that lens.
Yeah, that conservatives might be glossing over that some of the that the real that racism has been a problem in the country, and that racism does exist, and yet
no, I don't think the debate is over whether racism exists. The debate is over whether racism in and of itself explains the disparities that we have today.
Yes.
And to what extent it explains those disparities. Racism has been the constant. That's the problem with using racism as some sort of empirical explanation of outcomes. We've always had racism, but progress has not been constant. We've had progress in some eras, retrogression in other eras, stagnation in still other eras. But racism has been the constant. And so to say, I see this disparity and racism exists, end of discussion, seems to me to be not taking into account other factors that could be driving some of the disparities we see today, other factors that could be having a much larger impact. I mean, you talk about the importance of family structure, for example. So let's take poverty. Poverty for Blacks, typically in America over the past half century, has been roughly 3 times what it's been among whites, the poverty rate. But among Black married couples, Black poverty is in the single digits and has been for more than 25 years. So is the Black poverty rate a function of racism or family structure?
Yeah.
And so that is where we can all agree that racism still exists. It has not been vanquished from America. Neither has sexism, neither has homophobia, neither has anti-Semitism. The question is to what extent these prejudices explain the disparities we see today. And to what extent do other factors play a role in these disparities?
If I could just if I could just guess about the grievance of people in Greenwich, I know a few of them, but the white grievances of people in Greenwich, maybe this is what the questioner is referring to, is how much they should be forced to take responsibility for racism in this country. And the kind of discussion we're having now about collective culpability for racism, about reparations, about the fact that their children are now going to schools where they have to proclaim their white privilege in 3rd grade. And they have to pretend that they're responsible for things that happened, years ago, and things that they were never involved in. I think that that is a legitimate grievance. And I don't think that most people in America really want themselves or their children to sort of participate in this, sort of performative mea culpa that's going on right now. I think people think, there's individual responsibility. I don't think the people in Greenwich deny that there's racism either. But whether, their children should be forced in school to claim responsibility for all that racism, or whether they should be responsible for paying for reparations or treating Black people differently today as a result of that, I think is where they do have a legitimate grievance.
That's very nicely answered. Thank you, Naomi. Well, we're at the 9:15 mark, and so we're a little bit over, but it was a very, very fascinating conversation that really gave us a lot of food for thought, and as well as some of the comments by our people in the audience. I wanted to thank very much the BPALC and the co-sponsor of this, which is the Open Discourse Coalition. If the people in the audience want to go on opendiscoursecoalition.org to help support programming like this, please do. If you know students at Bucknell who are interested in taking a leadership seminar by Professor Groover offered through the Open Discourse Coalition on Saturdays next fall. That information is also on opendiscoursecoalition.org, which is an absolutely wonderful opportunity to learn from one of the professors that's been honored with a Distinguished Teaching Award at Bucknell, who now is a faculty fellow at the Open Discourse Coalition. But we are extremely grateful to Jason and Naomi, you both, for making time to talk about these issues that are hard to talk about and that we want to bring much compassion to, and that they're, in terms of the solution, I wish we came out of these conversations with many solutions and all this, and maybe part of the solutions that people think about is tapping more people to go into the foster parent, child, to foster a child and be part of that. Anything that either of you would like to say as we wind up, and final thoughts?
No, just thank you again
Thank you.
for holding this forum. I enjoyed it, and I'm thankful that you invited me and Naomi to participate.
Thank you. Well,
Yeah.
thank you again, and you both were wonderful, and we're very grateful. Thank you. And we have one person who said, "Thank you for speaking honestly and with common sense." The battle versus common sense is exhausting, so we'll leave that on that note. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very, very much, and we appreciate it again. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good night.